what I present is the history of the Confederate States of America. Unabashed. I'm not a historian. I tell everybody that wherever I go. I'm a partisan. I'm a Confederate. I give an intensely biased view. Bias is valid. It's the truth. It's just my side. I don't care about the other side. You'll never see a court case where the prosecution cares about the defense or the defense cares about the prosecution. And that's the way it should be. Each side should be afforded an equal opportunity to defend themselves and express themselves in their own eloquent, biased way. So I always like to preface that so nobody will misconstrue and think that what I'm really trying to do is fool you into thinking that I'm correct. That's what professors do. And I usually embarrass them in their own classes by pointing out that they're really not correct. They're biased too. They just won't admit it. But I always start out by admitting that I'm biased. I'm going to show you the southern side, and that's it. My primary reference is a book called A Southern View of the Invasion of the Southern States and the War of 1861 to 65. This is an original copy, but it is in reprint if anybody wants a copy. It was written by Captain Samuel A. Ashe of North Carolina. He was the last officer of the Confederate States of America commissioned by Jeff Davis, and he survived until his mid-90s. So he was a very old gentleman, but he did some of the finest defense of the Southern view in his book that you'll find, and it's very short. We don't need a long 11 hours to present our side. So I don't make all this up. This is the same line that's been presented by our ancestors straight through from the beginning. Now, in his series, Ken Burns proposes that the war was fought over slavery. Now, this is a misconstruction that even historians, even northern historians, will admit is not true. Hollywood doesn't care. It sells. And Mr. Burns knew he could sell by purporting that view. If the war were fought over slavery, then you must assume that what you had is one side owned a group of people and they kept them in bondage, and the other group of people were so outraged that they got angry and they just invaded to free those people. I mean, that must be the scenario if the war was fought over slavery. Well, anybody who says that the northern states would have suited up a couple of million troops and invaded the South to free the black people is living in a fantasy world. Everyone knows, every historian I've run into, even the most far out abolitionist historian, will admit that the Northerners would have never invaded the South and risked a major war in order to free the slaves. That's just a preposterous statement. It could not have been that. Also, you must remember that some of the largest slave owners tried as hard as they could to prevent the secession of the southern states. Why would the largest of the slave owners wanted to prevent the secession of the southern states? Well, all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Constitution. The best way to preserve their slaves was to remain in the Union. It was specifically allowed in the articles in the Constitution and could have only been changed by a constitutional majority of the states, which they could have never gotten with the southern states involved. So the best hope of preserving the slave system would have been to remain in the Union and not leave the Union. So it begins to get very complex as to what might have caused this conflagration. First, let me give a backdrop. The southern and northern cultures of people are rooted in different lineages. The myth that it was a war of brother against brother is a complete fabrication. According to Dr. Grady McWhinney of Texas Christian University, the Lyndon Johnson professor of history there, and his now famous book, the Southern culture in general, particularly the culture of the Old South, was almost entirely a Celtic culture, which is very similar to their inherited bloodlines, which came from western, southwestern, northern England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. The northern culture, which was born of the New England culture, is primarily a culture of East Anglia, which is eastern and big city England. These were very, very different bloodlines. The people that settled New England were primarily of Danish and Saxon extraction, going back to the Middle Ages. The people of the Celtic fringe, those other areas of Britain which were pushed back by the Danes and the Saxons, those people were of the Celtic tribes which frequently migrated around Europe. That explains why the regions were so different. The people of New England were rooted in the cities in the eastern part of England. They were industrious. They loved to read. They liked education. On the other hand, the people of the Celtic cultures, of which most Southerners came from, they were hard drinking. They liked to fight. They had a lot of music. They were bardic. They liked to tell stories. That's the kind of people that have lived in those various parts of England for over 1,000 years. So, first of all, make no mistake about it, the Southerners and Northerners hated each other from the very first day they set foot here. And always did. The fighting between the Northerners and the Southerners goes back 1,000 years. And when I say that to classes, that one of them will always raise their hand and say, "But we weren't here 1,000 years." That's true, we were back in Britain. But it's the same fight. And if you don't believe it, read Grady McWhinney's book. It's a real revelation. Now, the Southerners were always viewed in contempt by the Northerners. The Northerners didn't like the fact that we were crackers. That's an old term coming from Britain, which means the kind of people that are always cracking jokes. That's where that basically comes from. We were a practical joking people. Well, let me say this. William Shakespeare came from the part of England that our people did. They were very artistic, very bardic. They liked to tell stories. They liked to have a good time. People in the North just hated that. They thought we were very arrogant, very informal. We weren't into industry like they were, or into the accumulation of wealth and money. We didn't like to read that much, although we loved to talk and sing. So there was a clash of cultures from the beginning. And of course, in New England, they had an advantage on us. They loved to write. So they wrote all the early history books. So believe it or not, when everywhere I go in school classes and I ask children to raise their hand and tell me about how America was founded, they talk about a religious cult of pilgrims in a place called Plymouth. We had ancestors planting corn in Virginia for 13 years before they ever got here. America was founded in the South long before those people ever got to New England. If you ever heard of Captain John Smith in the Jamestown colony, that's where it started, over on the Chesapeake in Virginia. It had nothing to do with the religious cults of New England. They didn't even have a large population for many, many years. But they wrote the first history books. It's very important to remember. So the cultures were very different from the outset. No doubt about that. I could make many references to the writings among the regions and what they said about each other. It made it far worse in 1650 when all the royalists of the English Civil War came to America to flee Oliver Cromwell. And to the man, they all came to the South. That really made the Northerners jealous. And from then on, we were really looked upon as cavaliers. And of course, we played the part. We acted as cavaliers. We were haughty, holier than thou, you might say. We would duel in a minute. And New Englanders did not like to duel. So in a way, man to man, they were sort of afraid of the Southerners too. The problems between the North and the South should have produced two nations all along. They were just that different. Everybody knows that. But after the break with England, after we seceded from the Union with England, and were miraculously able to defeat the British Empire, we didn't really defeat them, they gave up. Of course, we had the French fleet to help, that helps. But after we defeated the British Empire, they had to find some way to get these disparate regions together into one government, if they could. So they created the first of its kind of governmental compact that was ever devised. In 1777, we became a confederacy under the Articles of Confederation. It was the first time we'd ever broken away from a king or a despot. It was an amazing type of government. So this confederacy was a compact of sovereign states. The Articles of Confederation were a very interesting document. Two articles in particular of the compact were interesting. Article 2, for instance, said that all states would be sovereign and independent, and only the powers delegated to a national government would be not reserved by the states. Another article in the Articles of Confederation said that the institution of slavery would not be allowed into the new territories, which is curious. Perhaps if they had never gone away from the Articles of Confederation, we would have had no war between the states. It's an interesting proposition. But that particular article seems that it might have prevented some of the problems of later. But the new compact under the Confederation didn't work very well after the American Revolution was over. There were two good reasons. First, military. They were afraid of the major powers of the world because we were not a major power then. So defense was a consideration. And secondly, their money was no good. You couldn't go from North Carolina to Georgia and buy a farm with North Carolina money. They wanted Georgia money. So they met again a short time later and decided they better form what later became the U.S. Constitution. They called it a more perfect union. Now, a more perfect union doesn't mean a tighter union, necessarily, or a more inviolable union. It just means it works more perfect. It works better. In fact, the U.S. Constitution is less of a binding document than the Articles of Confederation were. Now, some teachers might disagree with that. But if you'll read the writings of Webster and Adams and some of the people that were there, you'll find out that the Constitution was intended specifically not to be a more binding document than the Articles of Confederation. Bear in mind that the Articles of Confederation were called a perpetual union in the document. A perpetual union. That's not very equivocal wording. So what happened when they abandoned the Articles of Confederation? 9 states seceded from that union, that perpetual union, and formed the Constitutional Compact. The other few finally came in later. So in the early days, there was no bones about secession. They seceded from the Articles of Confederation and formed the Constitution. The Constitution, when they wrote that document, they debated whether they should call it a perpetual union or not, like the Articles of Confederation. They voted not to. And they carried the wording of Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation directly into the Constitution as the 10th Amendment, which says that all rights not delegated to the national government will be reserved by the states. Webster himself said that the states are nations. Webster himself, the great hater of the South. But as soon as they formed the Constitution, it began to pull apart. Now, this is a part that Northern historians really don't like to talk about very much. But there were 3 very serious secession movements before 1861, very close calls of secession. The states were bound to break apart sooner or later. If you review these episodes, Winston Churchill said our war between the states was the most inevitable in history, because sooner or later some states were going to leave for one reason or another. The document allowed it. It was written that way on purpose, or there would have never been a constitution. So sooner or later some states were going to try it. Follow these events. In 1803, Massachusetts threatened to secede from the Union if Louisiana was purchased. Western lands was always a cause of secession threats, and the very first one was by Massachusetts. Josiah Quincy gave a speech in 1803 that could have been written in Montgomery in 1861 on Massachusetts' right to secede from the Union. Webster echoed that and claimed Massachusetts had every right in the world to secede from the Union because their power would be diluted by this new Western territory, these new Western states. Purely through the negotiations and compromises of Jefferson and Clay and Webster and some of the great senators, they were able to avoid it in 1803. In 1814, it came up again, only this time it was very close. We almost had a secession in 1814. The states of New England, who demanded that we enter the War of 1812, decided it was too hot for them, like they always do during wartime. And they didn't want to fight by the time 1814 rolled around. So they met at the Hartford Convention in Connecticut. All the New England states met at a convention. and they considered articles of secession from the Union. Now, that was organized by the Federalist Party, of all things, the people that wanted to join us together as a union. And they would have probably acted on their secession threat had General Jackson not defeated the British while they were in convention and the war ended. They were so humiliated by that the Federalist Party ceased to exist from that point on. America was so proud of having defeated the British again and the Indians in the War of 1812. But there again, you see, for a second time, northern states tried to tender their secession and very nearly did it. In fact, my understanding was that a delegate was actually preparing to leave for Washington to submit the secession document when word reached their convention that the war was over. And something happened shortly thereafter, though, something that proved the animosity between the North and the South, particularly the Northerners versus the Southerners, because the third secession movement rolled around in 1828. The period 1828 to 34 was another very close call in secession. But this time it was a little different. For the first time, a southern state threatened to secede. It was South Carolina. They began to realize that most of the money for the federal government was coming from the southern states and their agriculture. But they weren't receiving their fair share of what was coming back to the states and the federal budget. And it made them very angry. There were a series of tariff laws that were issued against the states that were very unfair to the agricultural states during that period. You ask yourself, well, how could they have done it in Congress? It was very balanced at that time. Well, it had been balanced up until then. There were 2 senators per state, and the populations were fairly even. But by that time, the North was importing large numbers of workers to their factories, so the population was shifting to the North rather dramatically, which means the House of Representatives became overbalanced with Northern representatives, while the Senate still remained balanced North and South. Money bills and budgets come out of the House. The Senate always ended up compromising them. One issue after another came out of the House, pitting the North against the South. And each time the Senate had to compromise these issues. The money bills were particularly inflaming to the South. We felt we were being bled dry and treated as an agricultural colony. So when South Carolina threatened to nullify any federal law that they didn't want to abide by, that they felt was unfair against their state financially or any other fashion, then the Northern rhetoric changed dramatically. Then the very people like Webster and Quincy who had said that New England had the right to secede from the Union, they claimed then that South Carolina did not have the right to secede from the Union. Webster, in the greatest flip-flop in history, came back and began finding beautiful logic to support his contention that states could not secede. But up until that time, of course, he would have gone the other way. Now, you notice I've mentioned 3 very near secessions so far. None of them had anything to do with slavery. They all had something to do with totally different issues. So clearly, our war between the states was an issue of the inviolability of the Union. Some states quit the Union. They were going to sooner or later over something. There was no doubt about that. That had been proven. Sooner or later, something was going to drive the regions apart to a point that would reach a flashpoint. And that began to happen in the late 1850s. Animosity in Congress grew worse and worse over the money bills. The South, the leaders of the South, the senators who were extremely eloquent, could easily, logically, in their debates, defend the Southern arguments. It merely made the Northerners angry. They found everything they could possibly find to belittle the South, to try to coerce the South with, particularly the money bills. But the one thing that they latched onto, when I say they, I mean a smaller group of what they were called even then liberals in New England, were they latched onto the issue of the slaves in the South in order to inflame the people of the North against the Southerners. Now this at the time was viewed as very unfair to Southerners because, first of all, between 9 and 10% of the people in the South had any slaves. 90% of the people didn't. They didn't want to hear all the time in the newspapers what cruel people they were, because 90% of the people in the South got up and worked out in those hot fields just like everybody else did. And they didn't want to hear what kind of bad people they were because their neighbors down the road had some slaves. But they had to endure this rhetoric about how terrible they were. Bear in mind another thing. Never was there one slave ship chartered in a southern port. Not one that anyone's ever found. All of the slave ships were chartered out of New York and Boston. Let that sink in a minute. The early financial infrastructure of New York and Boston was built on the slave trade. They brought them here and sold them here because they didn't work out in factories in the North. If they had, I can assure you they would have been there, or they would have remained there. Bear in mind that slavery started in the North for the most part. The first legalization of slavery was in 1642 in Massachusetts. But they did away with it very easily because the slaves did not live very well in the cold region. And so they just naturally did better here. But the Southern people didn't want to hear about this from folks who had brought them here and sold them here and made a lot of money for it and didn't want them there. So the animosity and the acrimony grew worse and worse. It would have happened over something. Northerners and Southerners didn't like each other for hundreds of reasons. They always found something to fight about. But what was happening in the late 1850s was particularly bad because a combination of the Western land issue boiling up again and the states struggling over who was going to get the Western lands, which had nearly caused a secession before, rose at the same time that the animosities rose concerning the slaves. Now, Western lands was an interesting issue. The Southern people felt like that the New Englanders trying to pass laws to prevent anybody from taking a slave into the new territories out west, that didn't really affect them very much economically. What it did was it was a punitive law. It meant we don't want Southerners in that territory. You couldn't even take one slave. You couldn't take any. What that told a person living in Georgia at that time was that their children were not welcome in that Western territory. Most people didn't go to the Western territories, their children did as they grew up. So they viewed the law as merely anti-Southern. They just wanted to keep our folks out of the Western territory. It was another ploy on the part of the New Englanders to capture the Western lands for their own interest. So it was strongly resisted by the Southern senators, all of the laws that were written concerning the Western lands. But since the South was very, very successful in these actions in the Congress because of their constitutional basis, they tried another ploy, the liberals of New England. And this particular issue finally did the trick. The abolitionist movement, which was very small in New England, believed that the slaves should be set free, which sounds very commendable and very moral, and it really was. It would have been nice had they found some appropriate way to do away with the system. The New Englanders found a wonderful way to work people in the factories of the North. They just pay them a slave wage and sell them everything from the company store, so they'd have to work all their life for the company and they couldn't leave. And they had them under labor contracts, so they couldn't leave. And of course, it wasn't nearly as gracious as our slave system, because when they got old and infirm, they just fired them and hired someone else. Whereas here, we took care of the slaves from birth to death. So we had a far more gracious system here, and we didn't see theirs as being any more moral than our system was. But they brought the morality claim up to a feverish pitch. Now, there was a book published in 1858, and nobody ever gets it right when I ask them what the name of the book was. They all think it's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It wasn't. It was a book called The Impending Crisis. It was written by Hinton Helper, and the book was a terrorist's manifesto that was published by the abolitionists and smuggled into the South, which was to train the slaves how to rise up and kill all of the white people of the South and obtain their freedom through insurrection. Now, this was a scary thought to Southerners at the time. Remember, 90% didn't own slaves, but everybody lived near some. And the South was very familiar with the Indian Wars, where the Indians would come riding in at night and slay everybody in the town. So it was scary that a book was published and 100,000 copies were printed in 1858 and smuggled into the South and given to slaves throughout the South by these organizations. The book was very detailed. It told how to appoint a time and a place for them all to meet and take their axes and kill all the people in their beds and such. It was very specific. It was calling for what they feared to be the Great Insurrection at the time. And they knew all about the insurrections in Santo Domingo and Haiti. They were very familiar with those, where thousands of white people were slain on those islands down there. So it was a scary thought to the Southerners that anyone in America would call on the slaves to rise up and kill everybody. But that's exactly what that book did. And it scared the people in the South. But they, as they always did, they maintained their grace, and they just looked away and ignored it, tried to ignore it. They did do a few things. They passed laws against slaves learning to read at that time, because they certainly didn't want them to read that. Before then, they would allow them to read. But after this book was published, they wouldn't. Now, a series of events then happened which was very tragic. The first was John Brown's raid. John Brown, during his raid, had a copy of that book under his arm. He was trying to foment the very insurrection that the book talked about. He wanted the blacks of the South to rise up and follow him and go through the South killing all the people, the owners and such. It didn't work. The first man he killed was a free black man trying to fight against him. And, of course, he was eventually hanged. But it scared the South to death. It angered them, but more importantly, it scared them. Somebody really intended to do what that book said. They then would take it very serious after that. They formed militia units all over the South to prevent the insurrection. But the worst thing that could have possibly happened was during the presidential election of 1860, when most of the Republicans in the Congress signed a document supporting that book. Now, here was a major political party winning state after state during the election, calling on the destruction of the Southern people by an insurrection and the slaughter of the Southern people. Many people did sign that document. Most of the Republicans in Congress did at that time. That was the final straw. It wasn't the election of Lincoln. It wasn't anything else. It was the adoption by a major up-and-coming political party of a book calling for the slaughter of the Southern people, which then made senator after senator rise up and walk out of the Senate, and the states one by one vote secession. They had the right to secede. No one questioned that at the time. Of course, Lincoln was not going to preside over the destruction of his country. He decided to create an instance which leaders have long done in the history of the world, an instance where the other guy looks like he stepped over your line or knocked the chip off of your shoulder or whatever. He created the Fort Sumter instance. He pulled his troops out of every fort in the South because he knew he had no right to be in those forts. He left them in only Pickens and Sumter, right on the East Coast, where he could make a stand and cause us to shoot first. People have always said, but the South shot first. The South fired the first shot. Gentlemen, those were foreign troops on Confederate soil, hundreds of miles from the North. They were not firing on the North. They were firing on foreign troops in our country. The question is, what were United States troops doing in the Confederate States of America uninvited? They were asked to leave. They were offered boats to leave. Lincoln said they would leave. A negotiating commission was negotiating their leaving. Lincoln promised not to reprovision them. At the very instant he was sending a boat of provisions. He knew for sure that the Southern gentlemen would have to take action. So General Beauregard evicted them. And you all know the rest of the story. I won't really talk much about the war. You all know that. The Confederacy lost. But I will say this. Lincoln's war strategy during the entire war up through 1863 was based on the slave insurrection. Every action he took was to try to get the slaves to rise up and kill all the people in the South. This book publishes a memoranda that's part of the public record where a Northern general sends memoranda to other Northern generals appointing a time on a day for the slaves to rise up in the South and kill all the women and children left at home so the men will come home from the battlefield. That was still their strategy through 1863 until that famous memoranda where General Butler sent to Lincoln and said, Mr. President, we can arm the slaves of Louisiana, but if we do, they'll fight for the South. You see, the Southerners and Northerners were both wrong all the way up through 1863. There could have been no insurrection. Black people have always seen themselves as Southerners. And there was no animosity before Reconstruction. They got along fine together. There never would have been an insurrection. When all the men were away at war, and close to 85 to 90% of the Southern men were in uniform at one time or other during that war. During the entire war, there was hardly a case anywhere reported of rape or murder on the part of a slave against those defenseless women and children at home. Now that's an amazing statistic, but you won't find that. There would have been no insurrection, but the Southerners and Northerners just weren't sure. They just didn't know. But by 1863, Lincoln was convinced. So he changed his war strategy to a war of attrition. He had massive armies just march forward down into the South and destroy everything in their path. That finally worked. He played his only trump card, and that's superior numbers of men and materiel. And of course that worked. Like Churchill said, that's the only possible way the North could have won. The Reconstruction period was what we live with today. It was not Reconstruction at all, it was subjugation. We lived under military rule for years. The troops would not allow the Confederate veterans or their supporters to vote. They would only allow the freed slaves and the Republicans and the carpetbaggers to vote. The legislatures, the governor's chairs of all of the southern states were filled with Northerners for a decade. Anytime the southern majority tried to rise up and win an election, the subsequent presidents, Grant and Johnson, would send in troops and make sure that they were evicted from office. So we were held down specifically out of the voting booth for a decade while the state legislatures of all the Confederate states were looted. It's the saddest period in American history and the most undertold because it's embarrassing. More than half the federal budget in 1860 came from just 4 southern states in revenue. Southern states were wealthy, rolling in money, if you will. They were almost all bankrupt by 1876. Several were in fact bankrupt. They had been looted. Taxes had been raised repeatedly by these Northerners that were in the governor's chairs and in the legislatures until in Charleston, 93,000 pieces of land were auctioned off to the tax man in 1 year. So we were held out of the voting booth. Our land was stripped from us and taken away. But you know, you got to hand it to the Northerners. They didn't really have a whole lot of stomach for that. And even the Northern press got tired of it. And by about 1878, they were calling for this to end. So immediately, the Southerners took back their legislatures. They took back their governor's offices. They kicked out the carpetbaggers. They kicked out the blacks and the Republicans. And only in our lifetime have blacks and Republicans been allowed to vote in the South. That's a tragic legacy. But when you do that to the majority, they come back later and do that to the minority. And that's just a fact of life that we won't hide from. It's a good thing that Reconstruction's over. It ended during the 1960s, not the 1860s. And I think we're all proud that it has finally ended. And it brings us out of the house, I guess, to meetings like this. There's nothing to be ashamed of. But the South suffered for no other reason than that they declared independence and were defeated in a war. What they suffered, I could go on all night about with horror stories. But the good thing about it that I always like to impress on the audiences is the Confederate type of government was created by Southern men in 1777. It is a more pure type of democracy than the world had ever seen up until that time.
Go. I say go away. You bother me.